The Legend of Zelda series is filled with an ever-growing number of iconic locations and is home to many memorable people, more than 230 of whom call Breath of the Wild's Hyrule their home. There are numerous mysteries connected to the very names of places and people in the series. You may be aware that Navi, Link's companion fairy in Ocarina of Time, is named after the word navigation, likely reflecting her role as a kind of navigator for Link during his adventure. The history of Breath of the Wild's mysterious disappearing tribe, the Zonai, has been lost to time, yet there may be more of a focus on them in Tears of the Kingdom. The name Zonai derives from the Japanese word nazo, which means mystery or riddle, making it a very appropriate origin for a tribe whose entire premise is essentially nothing but that. Likewise, the places in the various worlds that make up the Zelda universe are not just given names at random. Most of the time, these places are named after a specific thing for a very particular reason. One of the locations you may have thought has an arbitrary name is Hateno Village, a Hylian settlement situated at the very edge of the far eastern region of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. Hateno Village's name is actually an amalgamation of multiple Japanese words. Hate, which refers to the end of something, and no, which can be understood as meaning of in English. Reversing the sentence structure reveals the true meaning of the name for Hateno Village to be Village of the End, with the end aspect likely a reference to the village's location at the very edge, at the very end of the borders of Hyrule. The abundance of iconic locations and characters in the Zelda series very often have unique hidden meanings to be discovered behind their names. So let's begin by examining what's concealed behind the Japanese text to discover more about the various races that make up the core of the Zelda universe, before finally moving on to learning more about the mystery surrounding the Lost Woods, its origins, history, and potential deeper significance in the future. Among the reoccurring races are the Goron, mountain dwellers who typically reside in mountainous regions such as Death Mountain or Snowhead. Their bodies can range quite dramatically in size, some even reaching heights comparable to Death Mountain's summit itself. These rock-like creatures are extremely strong. Many hold competitions such as sumo wrestling and rolling racing to gauge each other's physical prowess. The Gorons have a strong sense of brotherhood, and so the word brother is commonly used among many members of their tribe, and is typically used when referring to one of their own. Since Breath of the Wild in English, Gorons have also begun using the word Goro in their speech, often at the end of a sentence. You may imagine that this is similar to how they refer to one another as their brother. However, there is a little more to it than that. Goro derives from the Japanese word goro goro, an onomatopoeia for the sound falling rocks make in Japanese. While the Gorons in the English version of the Zelda series have only begun saying Goro more recently in 2017's Breath of the Wild, in the Japanese version of the Zelda games, they have been including it in their speech since 1998's Ocarina of Time. It functions as a kind of accent that defines them as Gorons, and it's also likely that the inspiration behind the origin of the name Goron originates from this onomatopoeia as well. Each time a Goron would say Goro in the Japanese version of the games, it's either replaced with brother in English or just removed entirely. One can assume that a possible reason this characteristic was cut in the English version of the games up until Breath of the Wild was due to the untranslatable nuances of the word itself, as there is no direct equivalent in English precisely because it is an onomatopoeia, a trend we'll become familiar with throughout this video. In Ocarina of Time, Child Link is tasked with gathering the 3 spiritual stones in order to access the Master Sword and the Sacred Realm. One of the 3 spiritual stones was said to be in the possession of Rito, a Zora princess who is trapped inside Jabu Jabu, a giant fish who serves as the guardian of the Zora. Using smaller fish as bait, Link gains access to the inside of Jabu Jabu after being swallowed along with it. This enormous fish is named Jabu Jabu in both the English and Japanese versions of the game, and just as Goro Goro is the onomatopoeia for the sound falling rocks make in Japanese, Jabu Jabu is also the imitation of another sound in Japanese, specifically the onomatopoeia for the sound of a water splash. Very fitting for such a large fish that will, without a doubt, make Jabu Jabu sounds the instant it moves. In The Wind Waker, the Zora are said to have evolved into the Rito, a humanoid bird-like race that possesses the ability to fly. The origin behind the word Rito can be deciphered by splitting the word in two, and then reversing the order of ri and to make tori, the Japanese word for bird, a very simple yet clever way to name the feathery race. Even the names of each individual Rito follow a unique naming convention. In Breath of the Wild specifically, the Rito are all named after Japanese chicken dishes. Some of these in particular are brilliant subtle puns. For instance, Teba, the Rito who helps Link board the divine beast Vah Medoh, is married to another Rito called Saki. These two Rito are husband and wife, and when you combine their names, you get Tebasaki, which is Japanese for chicken wings. Medli is a young Rito whom Link meets on Dragon Roost Island early on in The Wind Waker. Although she cannot fly well, Link can lift Medli above his head and benefit from her ability as a Rito for a short time and glide a brief distance. In the Japanese version of The Wind Waker, Medli's name is Medori. Medori is derived from the word Mendori, which translates literally to female hen, reflecting how although Medli is unable to fly as well as a fully grown Rito, she can still cover short distances, much like a hen can in the real world. Among the more common monsters that roam the various worlds in the Zelda series are the Bokoblin. These enemies typically serve the purpose of aiding the main antagonist. They can be encountered in Skyward Sword, where they follow Girahim and Demise, in The Wind Waker's Forsaken Fortress, where they serve as part of Ganondorf's army, and in camps scattered throughout Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, to name a few. Bokoblins resemble a variant of the Japanese Oni, a type of fierce demon in Japanese folklore. These demons typically wield a spiked club or bat called a kanabo as their weapon of choice, which they use to brutally smash their foes. Bokoblins depict this image of a Japanese Oni in Zelda, as they often use wooden bats that resemble kanabo in Breath of the Wild, or wooden sticks in The Wind Waker to repel their enemies. There are two parts to the Bokoblin name. The first is boko, which originates from the Japanese onomatopoeia for boko boko, the word given to describe the hollow sound a wooden stick makes when hit against something, and the second part, blin, derives from the English word goblin. Hence, the meaning behind the origin of the name Bokoblin is twofold. It depicts a demonic goblin that destroys things with wooden objects, typically with Japanese cannibal-inspired weapons. The Moblin are another species of recurring enemies who have appeared in many games since the first Zelda in 1986, and in this original Zelda game, they mostly keep to the wooded areas such as the Lost Woods. Moblins are similar to Bokoblins in that both of these species are parallel variants of a Japanese Oni or demon. They resemble Japanese demons with their horns and exceptional strength, and they are also followers of Ganon, the Demon King himself. Looking at the name given to these woodland-favouring creatures reveals immediate connections. In particular, the second half of the name Moblin also mirrors the naming style of the Bokoblin. Both blins in these names originates from the English word goblin. In the original Japanese versions of the Zelda games, the Moblin are called Moriburin, but the name warped to Moblin in the English releases over time, most likely for ease of pronunciation, as Moriburin can be quite a mouthful. The first part in the original name Moriburin is the Japanese word for forest, meaning that the name given to these enemies literally means forest goblin, which makes sense considering how these enemies are mostly found roaming in woodland areas. One of the tribes with strong connections to woodland areas is the Koroks. Said to be the evolution of the Kokiri, Koroks are small forest creatures who are under the protection of their sacred guardian, the Deku Tree. They reside in the Wind Waker's Forest Haven and in Breath of the Wild's Korok Forest. During Link's adventure in Breath of the Wild, he can encounter Koroks throughout the world and collect a seed from each one. Link can collect up to 900 of these seeds, presumably from 900 different Koroks, or perhaps it's multiple seeds from the same few, I'm not too sure. But the key point here is how Link collects their seeds. Despite the fact that Link is never told the names of the Koroks he encounters in the outside world, they are simply referred to as Koroks. This is not the case for the ones in the forest. Many of these Koroks have names. Among them are Daz, the general store owner, Pep, the innkeeper, and of course Hestu, to name a few. Each Korok that Link encounters in the Korok forest has a name that has been adapted from the Japanese names of different kinds of seeds, nuts, beans, mountains, and other related natural elements. One of the more obvious ones can be found in Tasho's name. This Korok's name in Japanese is Tachio. It is derived from pistachio, the Japanese word for pistachio. The Korok Peaks has the name pecan in Japanese, which is quite literally both the Japanese and English word for pecan. One of the more obscure ones can be discovered in Zuki's name. Zuki's name in Japanese is Azuki, which is Japanese for a type of red bean cultivated in Asia called the Adzuki bean in English. Daz, the Korok who runs the general store in the Deku Tree, has the name Dazi in Japanese. This name is a pun on the Japanese word daizu, meaning soybeans. Chio's name in Japanese is Staji, which directly translates to the name of a species of an evergreen tree called the Casanopsis tree that can be found in subtropical locations in Asia and within the forest area of the Tokyo Imperial Palace. This naming convention also applies to Hestu, the name of the bigger Korok with whom Link can trade Korok seeds for an expanded inventory. In Japanese, Hestu's name is Bokoblin. One source suggests that the origin for their name derives from Matsubokuri, the Japanese word for pinecone. Another proposes that their name is a corrupted anagram of kuri, meaning chestnut, and bo, an honorific used to address young males in Japanese. Surrounding the home of the Koroks in Breath of the Wild is one of the most mysterious reoccurring locations in the Zelda universe, the unique Lost Woods. As its name implies, the Lost Woods is a forested labyrinth with a perplexing nature that causes anyone who enters to become permanently lost. These mysterious woods have played many important roles in the series, from being the place where the Master Sword rests to being the maze that hides or protects a sacred place or temple. Every iteration of the Lost Woods is distinct, and each one abides by slightly different rules. Yet the one thing that they all share in common is that one must follow a very specific sequence of directions to successfully navigate them and avoid being trapped in a forsaken limbo. While the name The Lost Woods, as we refer to it in English, invokes the image of a fantastical place, this mysterious forest was once called by a different name in an earlier Zelda title. In the first Legend of Zelda, the forest was originally called the Forest of Maze in the in-game text, and was later renamed to the Lost Woods in the third installment of the series, A Link to the Past. While the Forest of Maze still certainly gives the impression of losing one's way, the word maze, at least in my opinion, doesn't quite invoke the same mystical images compared to what comes to mind when seeing the name The Lost Woods. The Lost Woods are referred to as Mayoi no Mori in the original Japanese version, and unlike in English, the naming convention for it has always remained consistent. It has never undergone any name change, and has always been called the same. This raises the question, why was the Forest of Maze altered to the Lost Woods in the English translation of subsequent games, and what is the significance? The Japanese title of the forest consists of three components: Mori, meaning forest in Japanese; no, which is the same grammar particle found in Hateno Village's Japanese name that dictates possession or ownership of something; and the final word, Mayoi. This word is the most significant as it hints at how the Lost Woods may be hiding even greater mysteries and implications, due to how Mayoi has several distinct and occasionally overlapping meanings and nuances. In the English version of the games From A Link to the Past onwards, Mayoi is rendered as lost. However, this word can also refer to illusion, delusion, indecision, spiritual and or mental confusion, hesitation, being lost, and it can even refer to the inability to achieve enlightenment. Naming the forest anything along the lines of Forest of Maze, Forest of Illusion, Forest of Hesitation, or even Forest of Inability to Achieve Enlightenment at a stretch would all be appropriate interpretations of the Japanese title, albeit The Lost Woods certainly feels like a more natural translation than something like Forest of Getting Lost. As a matter of fact, the Japanese title of the forest is so complex with its overlapping meanings, many other video games with their own Mayoi no Mori have each opted for different alternatives for their English releases. While the Lost Woods, as we refer to it in English, is an iconic location exclusive to The Legend of Zelda, the Japanese title isn't nearly as distinct as a name in Japanese video games. In other words, The Legend of Zelda is not the only franchise that features a Lost Woods. The Forest of Illusion in the English version of Super Mario World is also called Mayoi no Mori in Japanese, as is the Lost Lorn Forest in Pokemon Black and White, and the Forever Forest in Paper Mario, just to name a few. Mayoi no Mori is such a diverse title that each game uses a different English translation. The complexities of the Japanese names' meanings would explain why each iteration of The Legend of Zelda's Lost Woods are much more than simple maze-like forests where it's easy to get lost. The Japanese title conveys a strong, combined sense of illusion, mystery, and delusion, which each subsequent game in the franchise continues to expand upon through lore, visuals, and mechanics, all of which reflect the accurate nuance of the Japanese name for the Lost Woods. There's the strange phenomenon that causes Link to magically reappear at the forest entrance if he fails to navigate the correct sequence and lose his way, the terrifying rumors of how one will succumb to fate and transform into a Stalfos or Skull Kid if they remain within the boundaries of the forest for all too long, and the overwhelming sense of eeriness in Breath of the Wild's Lost Woods by being enveloped in a perpetually dense fog. Yet, even these characteristics don't come close to reflecting the magnitude of greater mystery and strange phenomena that the Japanese name implies are lurking within these woods. Recent games have begun exploring these themes further, and in Breath of the Wild, many of the trees feature cavities that resemble faces. These trees are known to the Koroks in Japanese as obake trees, which is a term for a supernatural being known as a yokai in Japanese folklore that has the ability to change its shape. When encountering these ominous face-bearing trees for the first time, I couldn't quite decipher if they were wearing faces of laughter or of agony. They reminded me at first of one of the many obake trees that exist within Japanese myths and stories. The one that came to mind was the Juboko. However, these are trees that can be found on battlefields and in places of brutal massacres. A Juboko may initially appear no different from the other trees that adorn the landscape, but approaching one reveals their more formidable and terrifying nature. Juboko were once ordinary trees, but the stained blood of the battlefield causes them to transform into terrifying monstrosities. They are able to move their branches, and in a desperate attempt to sate their lust, they will grab anyone who comes close and draw blood from them. Although it is more of a speculative approach, there are some visual similarities between the Juboko tree and the Obake trees seen in Breath of the Wild, with the most striking being that they both have faces on their trunks. Yet, making any further connections may be a little bit of a stretch, and while it does feel like the occurrence of something terrifying is inevitable the moment Link turns his back against them, nothing ever happens. While it's possible that these Obake trees in the Lost Woods may be hinting at something potentially deeper, as the word does connote an entity that can shapeshift, it's also probable that they are only called Obake trees because of how they are perceived by others. In Japanese, calling something obake out of fear is somewhat similar to how we shout ghost when we encounter something that is strange, out of the ordinary, and scary in English. The exact origin of these trees is mostly left up to speculation, but the fact that they are perceived as obake trees in Japanese further attributes to the overall magical and illusionary thematic characteristics of the Lost Woods, appropriately amplifying the deeper sense of mystery that lingers around the forest. While the forest was initially referred to as Forest of Maze in the in-game English text of the first Legend of Zelda, the physical map released alongside it refers to it as the Lost Woods. By a link to the past, the forest had evolved beyond its original status as a simple maze, and its in-game name had also changed to reflect the name we use today. Not only did it start to take on a more mystical appearance, but it also became the resting place for the legendary Master Sword. Around this time, the forest also began adapting more illusionary properties too, such as the numerous fake Master Swords that continually appear, keeping Link from finding the real one. I mentioned earlier that the Japanese title of the forest, Mayoi, can refer to an inability to attain enlightenment. This reveals a crucial link between the forest and something else very important in Zelda lore, which, as much as I'd like to share, would be too extensive to cover in this video alone. For now, I'll leave you with this premise. It's entirely possible that the eerie, foggy nature of the woods in Breath of the Wild depicts one's inability to achieve enlightenment. Just as the foggy atmosphere that envelops the woods clouds one's vision and the way forward, the path to enlightenment is also blurred. Thus, successfully traversing through the Lost Woods may also represent one's progress towards acquiring that freedom. With each new iteration, the mystery surrounding this magical location continues to grow, and it's very likely that there will be even more strange and ambiguous phenomena that will encompass the Lost Woods in future installments. Especially given the plethora of meanings attached to the Japanese name, anything is within the realm of possibility.